Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Bas and in this video I'm going to show you how to knit on a double bed knitting machine. It's this machine, it's a Passap Duomatic 80 knitting machine. It has a lot of knobs and levers and it can be very intimidating, but don't let that scare you because you can knit both very simple items as well as very complex items, and it's just a lot of fun. Here is the machine. You have two needle beds. That's why it's called a true double bed machine. We have a needle bed on the front and we have a needle bed on the back, and they're practically identical. The angle of the front needle bed is exactly the opposite of the angle of the back needle bed. The back needle bed is fixed in height, but it can move from left to right to knit variations in stitch patterns, and the front needle bed is fixed in width, cannot move from left to right, but can move down to access the knitting. So I'll show you how to move the front bed down like this. Now you can access the knitting. Put the needle bed back up, and the back needle bed can move from left to right. So I will put one needle out so you can see it moving. I'll move the racking handle and the bed will shift. And back. The needles have a spacing of 5 millimeters, and we have 179 needles on the front bed and 179 needles on the back bed. The needles are identical on the front as on the back. They're all interchangeable. Let's zoom in on the needle bed. This is the front needle bed. We have needles in this section and we have pushers in this section. Needles have two positions. These two positions. They are either against the rail out of work, or they are in this position and they are in work. Then we have the pushers below. The pushers have three positions. These three positions, 1, 2, 3. Pushers in the needle rail are just in rest, they do nothing, they're disabled. Pushers in this position are in a resting position during knitting. They're against the pusher rail. Pushers in this position are in working position. The pushers are meant to give instructions to the needles depending on the settings of your lock. More about that in a minute. The front and back bed are exactly the same. The needles have latches. This is a latch, this is a closed latch, this is an open latch. And they make sure that the needles are able to pull the thread through the previous loops and create a knitted fabric. The machine does it all automatically. When the racking handle is in a lower position, the needles are in between each other. They can all slide freely. When the racking handle is in its upper position, the back bed shifts. Now the needles are opposite each other. They cannot knit freely. They will collide. You have to remember this because depending on what you are doing, the needles must never collide. We have a row counter trigger, which is this black piece, which will trigger the row counter every time the lock passes this trigger. Furthermore, we have edge springs, which are springs that you put on the outer needles, and they help the edge springs knit. Always make sure the edge springs are on needles with closed latches. Same for the back bed, also. Okay, the locks. These are the locks. What do the locks do? The locks slide over the needle beds from left to right, from right to left. And they knit off the needles. The back lock has the same settings as the front lock. Let's zoom in. This is the front lock. First of all, it has a row counter. And the row counter counts all the rows you're knitting. You can reset the row counter. The row counter is triggered by the row counter trigger on the needle bed. Then we have the stitch size dial, and stitch sizes vary from 1 to 8 and quarters in between. The lowest setting is for thin yarns and the highest setting is for thicker yarns. Then we have a settings dial from A to H. And these settings all indicate different options for knitting with this machine. So for example, C is circular knitting, B is knitting with needle pushers, G is a free pass, it has all settings. But for this video, I'm going to focus only on a few. Then we have a lever, which can be set to N for normal knitting or X. N for normal knitting means that this dial is disabled. So it doesn't matter what this dial says, when it's on N, it always knits normally. Needles into work knit, needles out of work do not knit. When it's set to X, this dial is into work. So the settings on this dial are relevant now. You can only change the settings dial if it's on N, but it only will work when it's in X. So the lever is on N. Now I can change this. I'm going to put it on CX, back to X. Now it's on CX, which means circular knitting. If I want to change it to GX, I'm going to go to N, to G, back to X. Now it's on GX, and this means it's a free pass. The lock is disabled and it does not knit. When I want to go to BX, I go to N, B, X. Now the lock is on BX, and this means that the lock will knit with the needle pushers. Most common is GX for out of work or N for normal knitting. These settings are exactly the same on the back lock, only the back lock doesn't have a row counter, but it doesn't have to. Then we have the arrow keys on the left bottom of the lock, a left arrow, a right arrow and a 0. You can push one or more of these buttons. So let's push the left arrow, right arrow, and the 0 key cancels them out. And these arrow buttons give instructions to the needle pushers on the lower part of the needle bed to change positions. In between the locks we have a diagram, and in my case it's Dutch language because I'm Dutch, but French will have a French diagram. For English knitters they will use an English diagram, you get the picture. And it has like a cheat sheet for the settings of the lock. So these numbers, N, CX, DX, HX, etc. are what you can dial into the lock. Then we have a connection bolt. Now the locks move independently from each other. Most of the time you'll have them connected. Then we have this, and this is called a jaw, which I think is really funny, but it's kind of like a jaw. And it's for the yarn eyelet to feed through to be able to knit. And then we have strippers. We have orange strippers and we have black strippers. When knitting on a knitting machine, you need to push the fabric down so it is evenly fed between the beds. Orange strippers are intended for double bed knitting, when the fabric goes from the front to the back bed, and the black strippers are used for single bed knitting, when you knit on only the front bed or only the back bed, or on front and then back, but one bed at a time. The strippers are inserted in these slots, like so. Okay, so the yarn for this machine. The easiest thing, and that's pretty much for most knitting machines, is about a 4-ply. That's a standard sock yarn, 75% wool, 25% polyamide, and it has I think balls of 50 grams and then 205, 210 meters on a ball of 50 grams. You can also buy yarn on cones, but this is about the easiest to start with on a knitting machine. You can knit finer yarns, you can knit thicker yarns, you can use all kinds of yarns, but to start it's easiest with the sock yarn. So let's thread the machine. I'm taking my double-eyed bodkin tool because it's just easier to thread it with the needle. Through this eyelet, in between the tension discs, pull the tension disc out, lay the yarn in. The tension discs usually have a setting of 3.5. For most yarns that's sufficient. Remove the spring, thread it through this eyelet, through the eyelet on the spring and through the last eyelet. Now the tension mast is threaded. And finally thread the yarn feeders in the color changer. I'm going to remove the first one. Thread the yarn, place it back, lower the front bed, drop the yarn in between the beds and hook it into the yarn stopper. Front bed back up again. Now my first feeding eyelet is threaded and I can do the same with the second if I want to. Since I'm only using one yarn for this video, I'll leave it empty. This is the 2-color changer. It's pretty standard. You also have a 4-color changer, but this is the 2-color changer. It has a lever, and when you pull the lever to the right, all feeding eyelets will jump up. Now you can decide the sequence you want the locks to use the yarn. Down, pull once, down. Now the sequence is set. This will be picked up first, then this. So when I slide my lock over the color changer, this color will be picked up. Now if I want to change colors and I slide it over the color changer again, the feeding eyelet will be positioned back into the holder and the second color will pop up. Like so. Okay, basically this is all you need to know to get started. Of course, I can tell a lot more about this machine. There are a lot of settings you can do, things to learn, but for the starter video on this machine, this is basically it. So let's knit a swatch. Okay, so for this example I'm going to knit a double bed fabric on both beds. I'm going to knit a 1x1 rib. I have my needle beds in full pitch. The needles are exactly opposite each other. So the needles collide, they bump into each other. And I'm going to select from the center 15 needles to the left and 15 needles to the right. Same on the back bed. Now I'm going to take half of the needles back out of work. And because there is a needle rule on Passap, the outer needle on the right must be on the back bed and the outer needle on the left must be on the front bed. So when I'm taking half of my needles out, I'm taking them out from the right, like so. And I'm taking half of the needles out like so. So the rightmost needle is on the back bed, this one, and the leftmost needle is on the front bed, this one. So now I'm set up for 1x1 ribbing. And because I took half of the needles out of work, the needles do not collide, they just are perfectly in between each other. Now I place my edge springs on the outer needles, And because the edge springs must be placed on needles with closed latches, I push my needles up and I pull them down so the latches close. And I do the same on the back bed. Now it's even easier to see with the edge springs that the outer needle on the right is on the back bed and the outer needle on the left is on the front bed. Now I set my front lock to normal knitting N and stitch size to 1.5. And I check that my row counter is on 0. And I do the same on the back lock. N for normal knitting, stitch size 1.5. And because I'm going to knit a double bed fabric, I have to use the orange strippers. I pick up my main color yarn and I knit my first zigzag row to cast on. You can see there's a zigzag in between the needles. I set my front lock to circular knitting, that's CX, and I change the stitch size to 2 3/4. And I do the same on the back lock, CX, stitch size 2 3/4. And now I'm going to knit 2 circular rows. Now I'm going to set up my locks for normal knitting, the rib, so I change back to N for normal knitting. Now this selection dial does not matter anymore and I change my stitch size to 3 3/4. Same for the back lock, normal knitting, 3 3/4. And now I knit my rib for as many rows as I like. So when you knit a garment, you usually start with ribbing for the hem and then you continue in stocking stitch for the rest of the piece. Ribbing is a double bed fabric, so it's knitting on 2 beds, a double bed, and stocking stitch is knit on 1 bed. It's a single bed fabric. So when transferring from ribbing to stocking stitch, we need to transfer the stitches from 1 bed to the other. And on Passap it's common practice to knit single bed knitting on the front bed. So we're going to transfer the stitches from the back bed to the front bed. So I'm taking my double-eyed bodkin tool and I'm going to transfer all the stitches from the back bed to the front. To do so, I'm adding the needles in between on the front bed. I remove the edge springs and I transfer them to the front bed. I hook my tool into the needle on the back bed, slide the stitch onto the double-eyed bodkin tool and flip the stitch on the needle on the front bed. And I do the same for all needles. It can help to pull on the fabric just a little bit from underneath in between the beds to help transfer them to the front bed. Okay, so all my stitches are on the front bed. I'm placing the edge springs on the outer needles. I make sure that the latches are closed, so I push the needles up and I take them down with closed latches. I remove the edge springs on the back bed and I make sure that all the needles are out of work. Now I set my front lock to single bed knitting and it's already on N for normal knitting, so that's okay. And I'm going to increase my stitch size to 5 1/4. And I check that my row counter is on 0. Because we are switching from double bed knitting with orange strippers, we're going to knit single bed now, so I'm going to have to replace them with the black strippers. Because I'm going to knit a single bed fabric on the front needle bed, the back needle bed is out of work, there are no needles, and I'm going to put the lock out of work as well, so the lock must be set to GX. The lever is on N, so I can change this dial to G, And now I change the lever to X. So now it's on GX. And I also like to put the stitch size back to 1. It doesn't matter because the lock is out of work, but that's just good practice. And now you just knit as many rows as you like. So now we're still knitting with the same number of needles as we started. So basically we get like a rectangle. But when you knit a garment, you want to shape the garment. So you need to be able to make increases and decreases. To increase one stitch, it's very easy. On the side of the lock, you just put one needle into work. I'm pulling it all the way up, placing the edge spring, and now I'll pull the needle down so the latch closes behind the edge spring. And I knit one row. So we have increased one stitch. Same on the other side. If I want to increase a stitch on this side, always increase one stitch on the side of the lock. I'm adding one needle into work, place the edge spring and pull the needle down to close the latch. Now take the lock across. So I've added one stitch on the right and I've added one stitch on the left. And you can continue like this to keep increasing. Now I've increased 4 stitches, 2 on the right, 2 on the left. If I want to increase multiple stitches, for example, if I want to increase 4 stitches, you do it on the opposite side of the lock and you place half of needles into work for the first pass and the other half on the second pass. So one needle into work, I skip one needle into work. That's half of the needles I want to increase. I place my edge spring on the outer needle, latch behind the edge spring, I take my lock across. Now I'm going to add the remaining needles, so 1 and 2. And I'm going to move the edge spring over one needle and I make sure the latch is closed. Now I take the lock across. So now I have increased 4 stitches on this side. If I want to decrease a stitch, you can do it on either side of the work, it doesn't matter. All you do is you hang the outer needle on the next needle. So if I want to decrease this stitch, I take my transfer tool, I hook it into the outer needle, I slide the stitch onto my transfer tool and I place it on the needle next to it, into the needle hook. I take my needle out of work, I reset the edge spring to the outer needle and I check that it's behind the closed latch. Same on this side. I remove the edge spring, I take the outer stitch and I place it on the stitch next to it. I put my needle out of work, I replace the edge spring on the outer needle and I check that the latch is closed. Now I have decreased 1 stitch on the right and I have decreased 1 stitch on the left. And you can take your lock across. If I want to decrease multiple stitches, it's the same as casting off. I remove my edge spring, I take my transfer tool, I hook it into the outer needle, I pull the needle up, I push the needle down, the stitch slides onto the transfer tool and I place it on the needle next to it. I pull that needle up, there are now 2 stitches behind the latch. I take my yarn and I wrap it around twice. One time below the latch and one time in the latch. And I pull the stitch through, so I make a new stitch by hand. The further you pull the stitch through, the looser your cast off will be. So now I have decreased 1 stitch. And I do the same again. On to the next stitch. Take the yarn, wrap it around twice. Pull the stitch through. And you continue like this for all needles. Now I cut the yarn and I pull it through the last stitch. And here is our knitting. As you can see, we have started with a beautiful rib, really stretchy, a 1 by 1 ribbing. Then we switch to stocking stitch, like a normal jersey stitch. And I've increased several stitches. Okay, so these are all the basics for knitting on a double bed knitting machine. In this case, the Passap Duomatic 18 knitting machine. It's a great machine with lots of options. I've only shown you just a few, but I hope it gives you a good idea of what you can do with a machine like this. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please leave a like. I wish you happy knitting and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!